And while Buckhorn is urging caution, some citizens in Jacksonville are moving to demands that thousands have signed onto a petition calling for the city to not accept hosting duties. Troy Kless is on your side downtown with more about this outcry.
Thank you, Jeannie. Now, Daniel Henry is the chairman of the Duval County Democratic Party, one of several opponents to bringing the RNC to Jacksonville. He says one of his concerns lies with the safety of likely protests that would occur in the city. He also says that with the time frame given, he doesn't think that Jacksonville would be able to handle the thousands of people that would be coming into town for this event. Daniel Henry is with the Duval County Democratic Party. He says he's not surprised that Mayor Lenny Curry would welcome the RNC to Jacksonville. Henry says that bringing President Trump to the First Coast would be a wrong move, given the unrest over police brutality in Jacksonville and around the country. A petition circulating online says that this convention could bring the largest protests in this country's history. Henry acknowledges there may be large crowds.
Having Trump, having the RNC in Jacksonville, it doesn't continue that progression of progress that we have. And frankly, it kind of inflames some of the national discussions we're talking about police brutality and race right to the forefront.
In the past, Mayor Lenny Curry tweeted the city would be honored to host the RNC, saying he has worked with Governor DeSantis to create a framework to attract events like this to the city.
We want to have the conversation, whether it's RNC, DNC, whatever, because I think it would be good for the people of Florida.
Henry also says that he is concerned about the risk associated as the COVID-19 pandemic is still ongoing. Now, coming up at 5:30, I spoke with a local doctor about what potential risks could there be if the RNC was brought here to the Bold City. We're live in downtown. Troy Kless, First Coast News, on your side.